name is Wendy Hisco, and on behalf of Brownell Library, I wanted to welcome you to our Snapshot event, Fire Sermons, Shakyamuni, Seneca, and Thoreau on Climate Trauma, with University of Vermont professor M.D. Usher. Snapshot is a Vermont Humanities weekly program that hosts a variety of speakers at public libraries each year. We extend our thanks to our partners at Vermont Humanities, as well as the generous underwriters who make it possible for us to offer such rich and robust programming. The sponsor of our entire Snapshot season is the Vermont Department of Libraries, the Institute of Museum and Library Services, and the Alma Gibbs Donchian Foundation. Today, we come together from across the state to listen, to learn, and to be inspired in community. Before we begin, I have a few brief housekeeping items. If you need restrooms, go to the main desk and they can direct you to the restrooms. And the next Snapshot event is Turning Stones, Discovering the Life of Water with St. Michael's College professor Declan McCabe, which will be hosted at the Goodrich Memorial Library in Newport at 7 p.m. on Wednesday, March 19th. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker. M.D. Usher is a professor at the University of Vermont. His positions include the Lyman Roberts Professor of Classical Languages and Literature, Professor at the Department of Geography and Geosciences in the Environmental Program, and affiliate of the Gund Institute for Environment. Please join me in welcoming M.D. Usher.
Thank you, Wendy. Can everybody hear me? Great. Well, welcome, and then welcome to folks who might be online, toggling in from Zoom. So we've got some stiff competition in the room here from folks next door because it's either Children's Story Hour or Teen Circle. And I'll tell you that room is full of activity. It's a hive of activity. This room is a little sparse, but that's okay because friends have things in common, and we'll have a little intimate discussion about this important topic, I think. So I'm going to talk a little bit about climate trauma, which has just recently entered the lexicon a couple of years ago, preceded not too long ago by the phrase eco-anxiety, about how we're processing the changes in the environment that are impacting our lives, and especially through natural disasters. But I wanted to contextualize that a little bit by telling you about the book that I'll be speaking from. What I'll be talking about today is from a chapter in this book, and it's coming out May 13th. Sorry, I don't have it now to hold before you. The thing about writing a book, if you don't know, this was completed like 2 years ago. Like, I haven't thought about this book in 2 years except for doing proofreading and all that sort of mechanical things that happen. It's always a slow process. So to me, it's old news, but it will be new news to you. I want to tell you about the title, Following Nature's Lead, subtitle a little more self-explanatory, Ancient Ways of Living in a Dying World. The title is a gloss on a philosophical catchphrase from antiquity, secundum naturam vivere in Latin, or kata phusin in Greek, ancient Greek. And what that phrase means is to live according to nature. Pretty much all the philosophical schools of Greco-Roman antiquity held as a premise that we should gauge how we make decisions, whether they be policy decisions or personal decisions, based on how well that they accord with the way things are in nature. Now, nature is a really slippery topic. What is nature? How do you define it? And many of those schools defined it differently. But that premise of like looking to nature first as your yardstick for human behavior, human ethics, and decisions is a very ancient idea, and something I think that we need to recover more than ever, given our situation that we face today. So this is what the larger book is about, and this is just one chapter. What I'm going to talk about today is just one chapter from it. Yeah, so when you write a book, you think like, wow, maybe I'll go on tour and maybe I'll like do a reading or something like that. I thought about that today, do a reading for you from the book. I opted against it. And I love this New Yorker cartoon. It's on the wall of anybody who's been in my office before will have maybe seen this on the door of my office. This is pretty much what amounts to being an author these days. You get a few readers if you're lucky, you get a few people who take it to heart and then maybe act on it. Maybe that will be you. This is what you wish for, but it's a begging game. So I'm not going to do a reading. I'm not going to ask you for money. Fortunately, Vermont Humanities is kind in that regard as well. But I am going to just talk off the cuff about some themes related to climate trauma in just a moment. But first, I just want to recognize the passing of a giant in the field of humanities in this state. This is Philip Ambrose, who passed away a few weeks ago. He was my teacher, my mentor. He was really a standard bearer for humanities in this state for his whole life. He taught at UVM for 40 years. You may be familiar with him, those in the Zoom audience or here, as the founder of Vermont Latin Day, where hundreds of students would descend upon the UVM campus to engage in skits and plays and activities having to do with ancient Latin. And single-handedly, he did more than perhaps anybody else to keep the Latin language and the study of the humanities in the Roman Empire and Republic alive in this state. So I just wanted to acknowledge, my gratitude to Ambrose and his contributions. A much less nice-looking fellow than Ambrose. Ambrose was quite a handsome man. Henry David Thoreau. Now, you are probably all familiar with him by reputation. You may have read Walden. You may have read, Maine Woods or some other work of his. He's an icon of American environmentalism. But what you probably don't know about Thoreau is that he was propelled into his experiment to live in that cabin on Emerson's woodlot near Walden Pond and build the cabin and write about it. By a traumatic experience involving a fire. So you probably don't know that 1 year before he moved to Walden Pond to build the cabin, he was out fishing with a friend near Walden Pond in Concord Woods and caught some fish, was making what they say in Massachusetts, some chowder on an old stump that they were burning, to kind of cook it. Fire got out of hand in windy and dry conditions, and 300 acres of the Concord Woods were decimated as a result of this. $2,000 worth of timber was lost. The locals, and he had just graduated from Harvard, and he was still living with his mom and dad, as many college graduates wind up doing. He was known to the locals as the woods burner. So even before he refused to pay his poll tax, even before he became the curmudgeon you may have met when you read Walden, delightful curmudgeon, I love Thoreau, he was already a local pariah for burning down the woods. Interestingly, we'll never know, he doesn't tell us, but you've got to wonder if that traumatic experience of a person who was an avowed a naturalist, right? A naturalist, somebody who loved nature, a keen observer of nature, was motivated by remorse or some sort of reorientation of his life to go out and do his Walden experiment based on that traumatic experience. Who knows? Maybe Thoreau invented climate trauma and made his way to the woods. So what is it how did Thoreau face that trauma? What was it that brought him kind of succor and strength in looking at his life and how to live in a world that was, in his view, kind of messed up? He looked to antiquity, and that endears him to me because my whole book is about looking to the ancients for ways forward in our own current situation of climate change, but also socioeconomic inequities, a lot of things I think pre-modernity have to speak to us from the past. Thoreau felt the same way. Here's what Thoreau says at the beginning of Walden about books. I think it's in the chapter of Walden called Reading. I'll read it. "It is not all books that are as dull as their readers." Love that line. He's so cheeky. "There are probably words addressed to our condition exactly, which, if we could really hear and understand, would be more salutary than the morning or the spring to our lives, and possibly put a new aspect on the face of things for us. How many a man, woman or child, has dated a new era of his life from the reading of a book?" So Thoreau tells us in Walden that reading needs to be conducted deliberately, right, and with full attention, that we shouldn't just breeze through it. We should read with intent. And he did that, and he felt that the ancients in particular were a source of wisdom that we should never lose and actually actively preserve. Here's what he says about reading ancient literature. And he means both Western, Greek and Roman classics, but also Eastern classics. Thoreau is very interested in the Eastern classics as well. This is also from Reading, I think. "Men sometimes speak as if the study of the classics would at length make way for more modern and practical studies. But the adventurous student will always study classics, in whatever language they may be written and however ancient they may be. They are the only oracles which are not decayed, and there are such answers to the most modern inquiry in them as Delphi and Dodona never gave. We might as well omit to study nature because she is old." I love that homology that he makes between studying the human past and studying nature. Nobody says we shouldn't study nature, right? Science and STEM is engaged with that 24/7. But the humanities is also studying the past, the human past, and the human experience of the natural world and the natural environment in the past. So I think that's a very prescient observation. Delphi and Dodona were two ancient oracle sites in antiquity that gave, wisdom from the gods, from Apollo and Zeus specifically. That's what that reference is. And that comment from Thoreau makes me think of this. Here's something you'll see in probably any ecology textbook today, even at the junior high level, that shows where we humans fit on the time scale of humanity. And Thoreau, writing in 1854, seems to, intuit this idea when he says we might as well omit to study nature because she is old. The world has been around for a long time, right? We are preceded by many, many organisms that have been around and are still with us, some no longer with us, like dinosaurs, for billions of years. The thing I want you to look at here is the appearance of our species relative to all other species on the planet. And then within that, the appearance of writing. And with the appearance of writing, traditionally, proverbially, we have the appearance of civilizations, the beginning of cities and all of that. They're all kind of coeval. They happen at the same time. This is a speck upon this spectrum of time. Can you have a spectrum of time? But this chronology, this is nothing, right? So to study the past is not really so far away in the scheme of things when you think about it. To study the past, to study Homer's world, for instance, the Odyssey, the Iliad, it's not a different world in one sense. It's the same world seen differently, refracted differently, experienced differently, given the socio-cultural expectations and technologies, or whatever you want to say, of the time. So studying the past is not so remote or obscure or obtuse as sometimes we make it out to be. These are our very recent human ancestors, the Homo sapiens sapiens. So we have a lot to learn from them, whether they're Eastern, Western, or indigenous. And much in the book, I talk about this bit I talk about that issue quite a bit in the book. All right, so going to the past, I'd like to talk about this guy. Shakyamuni, Buddha. His given name was Siddhartha. Shakyamuni is just a kind of an honorific epithet that he went by, or he was called by subsequently, which just means sage of the Sakya clan, which is where Siddhartha, the prince, the clan, and the royal family, the dynasty that he came from, they were called Shakya, the Shakyas. So Shakyamuni, Buddha. Why do I want to talk about him? Well, if you've seen images of the Buddha, there are many different Buddhas and many different kinds of images. They're all very subtle differences in the iconography. But on the top of his head, he has this flaming sword sort of thing coming off the top of his head. This image is from Thailand. So it's Theravadan Buddhism, not Mahayana Buddhism. And then he's got this little bulbous thing, kind of a man bun on the top too, called the Ushnisha, and the fire comes out from that. That signifies several things: his great wisdom, his enlightenment of realizing what the nature of reality is when he was meditating under the Bodhi tree that time. You're probably loosely familiar with this story. But there's something a little bit more to it that I think that ties in interestingly with this notion of the fires we've been experiencing: the Camp Fire of 2018 in California, the Maui fires in Hawaii, and other fires, not just Maui, and the Los Angeles and other fires, Palisades fires, very recently, just in January. And that is one of the first sermons that the Buddha gave after once he became the Buddha and was enlightened. The third sermon, in fact, was called the Fire Sermon. And it's so called because fire is the theme. Everything's on fire, he says to his audience. Bhikkhus, monks, everything is on fire. Tradition has it that he's speaking to a group of 1,000 followers, listeners, people who are interested in what he has to say, audience members. And we are told that they were Brahmin priests or Brahmin ascetics, which meant that they were not Buddhists yet. They were part of the Vedic tradition of Indic religion, and fire was central to their religious practice. A Brahmin householder, for example, we just got back from India actually, and we experienced this. It's still true. A Brahmin householder is responsible for keeping a fire, sacred fire, burning in the house at all times. The first words of the first hymn of the Rig Veda, the great classic collection of hymns called the Rig Veda, is "I worship fire." So fire is very much a part of what is now Hindu religion, but we call it back then Vedic religion. The Buddha seems to have known that. The Buddha was a teacher who used skillful means to kind of meet his audience where they were at, and he leverages their understanding or experience of fire to say everything's on fire. What does he mean by that? He means our passions are on fire. All the things that make up our personality are burning. They're aflame. And so is the physical world that we are experiencing. It's all aflame. It's aflamed with passion, desire, hatred, lust, attachment. And the Buddha's solution is to put out this fire, is to put out these fires or stop giving fuel to the fire to let them go out. And that whole process is known as, ultimately, nirvana. You may have heard that term. That means a flame, that alludes to a flame going out. So in the fire sermon, the Buddha is identifying the sources of what causes the conflagration that we live amidst, to speak metaphorically. And that is human desire, human wants, not needs, human passions, and perhaps, let's say, overreach. So the Buddha is calling us to kind of rein it in, to stop feeding the fire of our own destruction, and to find, ultimately, tranquility, peace, and happiness by non-attachment, by relinquishing of desire. Here's another picture of the Buddha. This is not the actual fire sermon. I couldn't find a good illustration quickly enough of that. This is the Buddha's first sermon to the first 5 to his close friends, the 5 followers that he had who were with him in the woods when he was an ascetic before he became enlightened. And you can still see the fiery nimbus that he has around his head there, suggesting that aspect. Now, something about the Buddha, I'm an admirer, but not totally uncritical. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with his conversion story, but he was a wealthy prince whose father kept him from all appearances of discomfort or woe. He basically lived in a palace bubble and never went out. And he was surrounded by all the fine things, fine women, blah, blah, blah. He had a wife and child by that point, happy life, protected. His parents were helicopter parents. However, he snuck out on 3 occasions from the palace, incognito, and to see what was on the outside. You're curious, right? I would be. And he sees 3 things on 3 different jaunts from his palace. He sees someone who's old and sick, someone who's old. Then he sees someone who is sick. And then he sees someone who's dead. He sees a dead body by the side of the street. And then that's somehow what makes him wake up and say, oh my gosh, life is suffering. I have to find out how to avoid this, how to avoid the suffering that is life, death, sickness, old age. Not in that order, reverse that order. And I thought, all right, he's been sheltered for a while. That's not the most profound observation that I can see coming from going outside of the palace. Why? Well, old age, sickness, and death are totally natural phenomena. You're not going to escape them. None of us are going to escape them. They are part of the whole cycle of life and death. If he had gone out and if he had seen human-induced suffering, like starving children, like a raped woman, or you fill in the blank of whatever horrific scene that human beings do to one another, and if he had seen that and made the connection, to me that is ethically much more bothersome and much more disturbing. Climate change, climate trauma, all right? We don't see the horrific immediate effects all the time as we drove into the lecture today or as we're going to drive home, but they are happening, they're brewing all around us. And then they come to fruition, come to a head in something like the Camp Fire or the Maui fires or the Palisades fire. Just that. If you think it was bad that the Buddha identified suffering as the human condition, we've got it worse with what human beings are doing to our own environment, our own planet, making life unlivable. Just a food for thought. All right, I'm going to transition to this guy, Seneca, another wise man, sage, philosopher type. So Seneca briefly lived just at the turn of the century. He was a contemporary of the Apostle Paul, St. Paul, if you're familiar with that guy, an Old New Testament writer. This is a herm or like a bust of Seneca, and on the other side is Socrates. The ancients loved to do this, loved to stick kind of like 2 wise people together and join them at the head, one facing one way, one the other, and I guess the idea is that Seneca is kind of like the Roman Socrates, but you don't see the Socrates character, but he's on the other side. So Seneca was the tutor to the Emperor Nero when the Emperor Nero was just a teenager. He then kind of morphed into being Nero's handler and speechwriter and general babysitter to kind of keep him out of trouble, and then later became a court advisor. So he was embroiled in one of the worst situations of Roman imperial history that we've had. You probably are familiar with Nero by reputation as the emperor who fiddled while Rome burned. Well, the rumor was that he started the fire in the first place to make room for a new palace for himself. Seneca was kind of, again, ensconced in that whole situation with Nero. And I'm not going to talk about the fire at Rome, but Seneca was very attuned to how life disasters or social and environmental disasters change us. And how we react to those disasters is the litmus test of what it means to be wise or to have equanimity in the face of suffering. So Seneca wrote a bunch of letters. He wrote letters that are really meant for us, but they're, when I say meant for us, meant for a general readership, but they are addressed to his friend, younger friend and protege, a guy named Lucilius. So we have 125, a whole bunch of letters. They're terrific, highly recommend them, very readable. And there are many good editions if you ever want to read the letters of Seneca, because they're not really letters, they're philosophical essays. He wrote one to Lucilius about relating to Lucilius the experience of a friend that Seneca had who was from Lyon in modern France, which was called Lugdunum back in the day in the Roman Empire. Seneca had heard from his friend, Abutius Liberalis, doesn't matter what his name is, but that's who he was, that Lyon had burned to the ground overnight. So it went from being a flourishing city to being burned to the ground overnight. And Seneca and the guy and his friend Abutius was obviously very upset about that. And Seneca took a chance to kind of think, what would I say to console this person, in that situation? And Seneca then writes to Lucilius and kind of tries out some ideas on him, like what I would say to Abutius were I to write to him in face of the fact that his city just burned to the ground, what to do. And that was in 64 AD. Seneca says that, he says to Lucilius, he says, it's going to take me longer to tell you that Lyon burned down than it took for the city to burn down. That's how sudden it was and unexpected it was. So Seneca, that event, we'll come back to that in a minute, and I'll get to what his advice is. But that event was the impetus for a modern systems scientist, a chemist from the University of Florence named Ugo Bardi, who was commissioned by the Club of Rome to do some analysis about collapse scenarios, given climate change, given the socioeconomic world population situation that we face. The Club of Rome was a group that commissioned a report from 1972 called The Limits to Growth. I'll skip ahead to that. That's that book there. In 1972, Donella Meadows and Dennis Meadows and these other two colleagues developed a model for the carrying capacity of the Earth, given the technological and industrial progress the world was making and the use of resources we were facing in 1972. And this became sort of a Bible for the environmental movement at the time. They used simulation models to kind of predict how long the world would last, and their verdict was grim, that we got to stop using resources now just to kind of stay at the level that we're at. Nothing of the kind has happened since 1972, believe me, and things are only getting worse. But it was a landmark work at the time that used systems modeling and computers to kind of come up with scenarios of what could happen. So Ugo Bardi came up with a similar model for the Club of Rome called the Seneca effect, called after Seneca's observation in that letter I just described to you. Seneca says, growth proceeds slowly, but collapse is quick. So it struck Seneca as kind of strange. Growth it happens. All of a sudden you realize, wow, they're already a teenager. I remember when they were in diapers. Or, growth happens, or our perception of growth, it seems like it's just going slowly, but then when collapse happens, it's all over. And this kind of, not a paradox, but this fact struck him as worth thinking more about. And Ugo Bardi also thought it would be good to model it. So he came up with this model and he called it the Seneca effect. And it's essentially this, and this is all based on numbers and scenarios and modeling, trust me. But it's a sigmoidal function where you see the growth proceeding from an initial condition at the bottom, growing, but then when collapse happens, it's precipitous, it falls off, and it comes back down to the original level, or sometimes below the level of the initial conditions, mathematically speaking. Growth. We're going to get to Seneca in a minute and his recommendations on how to deal with this. Growth itself is a precipitous phenomenon or an exponential phenomenon, and it has been since the Industrial Revolution. My colleague Tom Murphy, who's a physicist at San Diego, University of California, San Diego, on his blog, I think it's called Do the Math, has a whole set of graphs that chart, quite literally, the exponential growth the world has been experiencing, and what was also documented by The Limits to Growth, that book I told you about before from 1972, as he calls it, death by hockey sticks, because the shape of the curve is so abrupt. So the first one, these are just a few examples from many that he gives here. The human population, from the year 1000 up until the year 2000, the growth is unbelievable, marked. It's not gradual at all. It's like exponentially compounded upon itself, like compound interest, and it just keeps getting bigger and bigger. Global energy usage from right around 1800, it looks to me like where this graph begins, up until early 2000s. Unbelievable. What's the cause of that? Well, the discovery of fossil fuels and the invention of the internal combustion engine. And how far we've descended since then, I don't know. Advanced, gone, but the growth has been off the charts. And then here's an externality of that kind of growth: human population and global energy usage, extinction rates of animals, the same thing. So the hockey stick, death by hockey sticks, he calls it, is the kind of situation we face, and it precedes, right? It's the preliminary to the kind of collapse that the Seneca effect introduces. What's Seneca's solution to this? What does Seneca say we should do in the face of collapse? Again, think, this is a fire that's happened in Lyon. This is just excerpts I've taken from the letter in various points. And Seneca, I didn't say yet, but Seneca was a Stoic philosopher. He was of that school. So he was a philosopher who subscribed to a certain set of propositions that the Stoics laid out, Greek Stoics. You don't need to know the details of that, except that they were very much in the camp of living according to nature, what I described at the very beginning, right? To living within the bounds of what it means to be a human being as they understood it. He says, we should consider nothing unexpected. Our minds ought to conduct advanced reconnaissance for every situation. We should contemplate not what usually happens, but what can happen. Sounds a little pessimistic, but it also just sounds a little practical, guarded, smart, right? In the very midst of pleasures arise the causes of pain. This is a little more philosophical. I'll parse that a little bit for you. Seneca is saying, as I said before, it's kind of imperceptible as we drive here, drive home, have dinner, feed the kids, watch our Netflix, that as that's happening, right, other things are happening along concomitantly with that that are of our doing or not of our doing directly, but maybe indirectly, that are stewing, are building up, that are like, feeding the fire that the Buddha talks about, of phenomena that are going to result, there's going to be a payback, is going to result in pain. So that irony, that paradox, in the very midst of pleasures arise the causes of pain, is what he's getting at. Nothing is stable, he said, be it political or personal. Human destinies, like those of cities, turn over in cycles. Right. Will democracy last forever? I don't know. Things go over in cycles, right? Will this world last forever? Will our species last forever? Probably not, the way species have gone over the course of evolutionary history. So Seneca is inviting us to think along those lines, and he's using the fire at Lyon as an occasion to think along these lines. If we all thought along these lines, I think maybe we would be more cautious and maybe more restrained in kind of the decisions that we make personally and in a policy sphere. We should contemplate all scenarios, more Seneca. We should contemplate all scenarios and fortify our minds against whatever might come. Exiles, tortures, diseases, wars, shipwrecks. Think on these things. Now, he's being a little cheeky here. Of course, you're not going to go around like a morbid person thinking about these things all the time, but he's saying precisely because we don't, and we don't want to, we should make a point to do it once in a while, because it'll remind us this could happen to you. The Maui fire could be, well, on Long Island. It is on Long Island right now. There's a fire going on there. And then finally, Seneca says, we live in an environment that is destined to die. And then finally, he's not all a sourpuss. He says, a catastrophe often makes room for greater prosperity. So when the Seneca effect takes effect, as it were, right, collapse happens, new life can come about, is what he's saying. So what I'd like to do is transition and kind of wind this down. About 10 minutes, I'll try, leave time for questions. I want to return to Walden Pond. So Thoreau, the guy who went out to build a cabin, to write the book Walden, to rethink his life, to live deliberately, did so perhaps from a traumatic experience of burning down Concord woods, right? Guilt, remorse, whatever it was. Here's Herbert Gleason's photo of Concord woods, early 1900s. Thoreau, as you know, spent time at the cabin, was very carefully observant of all the seasons and cycles of nature, and then ruing and meditating on what it means to be a human being in that context, what civilization is vis-a-vis the natural world. All of those things really inform Walden. Something else you might not know unless you got to the end of Walden is that there was a railroad line that went right through Walden Pond, and it comes that close to the pond. So 1 year before Thoreau started building his cabin, the Fitchburg Railroad laid down tracks and built a rail line linking Fitchburg to Boston and other points east and eventually north, reaching Burlington, Vermont, actually, with the Burlington line. And Thoreau would go, Thoreau, he lived with his parents after he graduated. He went to build a cabin, but he would go home to his parents too to do his laundry. And when he would go back to, I'm not kidding, he would go back to Concord town from the cabin. He would walk along the railroad tracks, which were then very freshly made, new, and he would walk along this, I'll tell you what this is in a minute. He would walk along this stretch, a very heavily excavated stretch where there had been like earth that had to be removed to make the track straight. And there were these massive sandbanks resulting on either side. And because it hadn't been revegetated because it was kind of new, it was a couple years old. And he would walk those tracks all the time in the spring, and he would notice, especially, some strange formations come from the freshly excavated, then packed earth that created this effect visually. And he called this sand foliage that would come out in the spring when the thawing bank, the sand bank that made up the edges of the railroad, were thawing. And as the water, the frost thawed from behind it, these like rivulets of sand and mud and stuff would come out. He was fascinated by these. And the penultimate, second to last, chapter of Walden is all about this. It's called Spring. And it's really interesting that Thoreau sees the most glorious apparition of spring in something that is man-made or human-made. That is, it's a product of a human intervention, like building a skyscraper in Los Angeles. The railroad tracks. He yet, walking along those tracks to go home and do his laundry, sees something like this and marvels at it. What does he say about it? I've got a couple things to read quickly to you. It's worth it. It was too much text to fit on the screen, but I do want you to hear it. Few phenomena, he says, gave me more delight than to observe the forms which thawing sand and clay assume in flowing down the sides of a deep cut on the railroad through which I passed on my way to the village. A phenomenon not very common on so large a scale, though the number of freshly exposed banks of the right material must have been greatly multiplied since railroads were invented. Now remember, railroads were only just invented really in Thoreau's time. It was the new technology. It was the AI of its period, transforming human relationships to each other and to the land. So the idea that these are only going to increase as railroads increase is what he's saying there. He continues, the whole bank, which is from 20 to 40 feet high, is sometimes overlaid with a mass of this kind of foliage or sandy rupture for a quarter of a mile on one or both sides, the produce of one spring day. What makes this sand foliage remarkable is its springing into existence thus suddenly. I like that. Not only does collapse happen suddenly, as in the Seneca effect, Thoreau says suddenly nature can be resilient, or at least our observance of nature, we see it happens all of a sudden. It's like an epiphany. He continues, it is wonderful how rapidly yet perfectly the sand organizes itself as it flows. So this is something that's happening as an internal mechanism of nature, right? It's just happening. He's mesmerized by that. And then he goes on to say, it seemed that this one hillside, the sandbank, illustrated the principle of all the operations of nature. So again, he's seeing in this microcosm a macrocosm of the potential of positive growth, right? Growth, cyclical growth that happens within nature. And this is the last bit I'd like to read from Thoreau. This is the frost coming out of the ground. This is spring. It precedes the green and flowery spring, as mythology precedes regular poetry. I know of nothing more purgative of winter fumes and indigestions. It convinces me that earth is still in her swaddling clothes, like a baby, and stretches forth baby fingers on every side. Fresh curls spring out from the baldest brow. There is nothing inorganic. These foliaceous heaps lie upon the bank like the slag of a furnace, showing that nature is in full blast within. The earth is not a mere fragment of dead history, stratum upon stratum, like the leaves of a book, to be studied by geologists and antiquaries chiefly, but it is living poetry, like the leaves of a tree, which precede flowers and fruit. Not a fossil earth, but a living earth. I can't do justice to it. The whole passage is a tour de force in nature's resilience, and Thoreau pulls out all the stops in describing it. Highly recommend it. But what I'd like to do is just give you a couple of final test cases or case studies of nature's resilience that you might be familiar with. This is an 1888 lithograph of the eruption of Krakatoa, the Indonesian island that happened in 1883, whose repercussions were felt as far as Los Angeles, actually, when it happened, changed weather patterns there. And I think 36,000 people died as a result of the actual explosion and the concomitant tsunamis that happened afterwards. So it was a major event. At Krakatoa, a year after it happened, scientists made an expedition. They could find like one spider and a few blades of grass. 25 years on, they discovered 202, I think, animal species living on the island, right? 50 years on, they found 800 animal species, and there had grown a forest, a small forest over the island by that point. Nature is resilient, right? Left to its own devices, it will spring back. It's got that ability. It's a living organism. Krakatoa is an example. Here's another favorite example of mine, and I'll close with these two. Here's one picture of it. Here's another picture of it that you can see kind of in context. I'll go back to this other picture. So these are what are called terrils, T-E-R-R-I-L-S, the terrils. They're slag heaps of coal from Nord-Pas-de-Calais in northern France. In 2012, I think, they joined the pyramids of Egypt as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. They are the result of course, human intervention, digging in the ground for coal and processing it. They are the scourings of that. And so they are a product of industrialization. Coal mining has been going on in that area for like 300 years prior. The little utopian villages that were set up for manufacturing the coal there, and all the processing plants were shut down in the 1960s, and then they became dormant at that point after the 60s. So since the 1960s, this area has then blossomed into this wholly new ecosystem. So there's a guy, I read an article about this, I think it was in The Guardian. There's a guy who started, he called it Chèvrerie de Terril, slag heap goat farm on the Terrils here, because the kind of growth that comes up in the immediate aftermath of, again, just a big pile of coal remains, is kind of the brushy stuff that goats like to eat and they thrive on. So he's got a goat farm on here. A vintner established a vineyard here because the coal tips provide the warmth and the drainage that are perfect for vines, and he makes a wine that he calls Chardonnay. Very funny, right, from the carbon output. So this region is now a flourishing ecosystem that, again, attests to the resilience of nature. So in looking at climate trauma and looking at the fires of Maui, Camp Fire, fires of Los Angeles, yes, it's awful, and people have to rebuild. But I think if nature can teach us anything on how we should face such disasters or respond to such disasters, it's that it has to change. It can't be the same pattern of development, settlement, or growth, because nature will also change. Yeah, so I think this idea of resilience applies to the human component as well, not only to nature. We need to be resilient, not only to get up by our bootstraps and build the same and build it better, but rather to be sensitive to what the ecosystem in which we live needs and what it can take, what it can stand. So there's a lot of fine-toothed and fine-grained, decisions to make within the process of doing that. But it's something that I think the wisdom of the past can teach us if we really keep those priorities in mind. So I'll stop there, and there is time for questions, fortunately. So if you have any, I'm all ears. Yes, sir.
I'm just thinking, for some reason we're not getting the message across. We keep perpetuating the same habits and so on, and I don't know what it's going to take unless it's a decline, to help us understand.
So what's that again? What's that? I didn't hear everything, so.
We're not getting the message.
Right.
Is it just going to take collapse to sort of set straight?
Yeah. So are you asking me how to make sure we get the message? Yeah, that's beyond my pay grade. But no, we're not getting the message. It's going to take the collapse. I mean, we see it. I mean, I don't want to sound like I think I'm an authority on this. I don't. I didn't live through those fires. I might think something very differently if I had. But you see these things happen, and they're just going to be happening more frequently and to more of us. And I think some mathematician will tell you, you'll reach a point where it happens frequently enough and to enough of us that it'll impel us to change. I mean, World War II changed a lot of things globally and politically, because it was so momentous and it involved everything and everybody, all resources, people, and something momentous has to happen, I think, to mobilize collectively humanity to act. It can't be negotiated. It can't be just done on good faith. I think the collapse has to happen to actually see the change. I don't wish it on any of us, but I don't see it happening otherwise. Human beings are just too recalcitrant, too stupid. The whole idea, in the midst of pleasure, is brewing the source of pain. Seneca nailed it. we do not live uncomfortable lives day to day. Until we do, we won't act. So I don't know. And again, I don't wish it on you or me. So, but. Yes?
I heard a lot of impermanence in your quotes from Seneca around, losing an entire city to fire. I was wondering if you found any connection between that sudden, loss and fire with Buddhism's approach to impermanence.
You mean like a direct connection?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there is. I mean, fire is also like the proverbial tester of quality, right? You put the image of like gold being refined in the fire. Fire is a tester, and it makes something better on the other side of it once it goes through the fire, and it's a transformer too. Just metallurgy in general, it has to be heated to change its from one form to another or one state to another. Seneca and the Buddha are thinking kind of along those lines, and fire has a very long tradition in the West Greco-Roman tradition as being that kind of transformer of materials, or the whatever. Heraclitus, for instance, thought that everything was based on fire. But something that the Buddha says, this may not exactly be what you're asking, but when the Buddha says that everything is on fire, it's an interesting thing. In Buddhism, there's the human personality and all phenomena are, I won't say reduced because it's not the right word, but they argue that they're made up of 5 what are called skandhas in Sanskrit, or khandhas in Pali. And it's nobody knows how to translate this term correctly. Some people say aggregates. So we're made up of these like 5 things that are aggregative piles or heaps of something, and it's the combination of those that makes up the person and makes up all phenomena. In other words, they're kind of a process, and the root of that word means wood or root. So a skandha, I looked it up in Monier Williams, and it means root. So it has to do with piles or heaps of fuel, like fire. So the Buddha is saying, like, fire is what, in a way, animates everything, but that's not necessarily a positive thing, because it's like burning out of control, right? It's when you snuff it out, or when it snuffs out, when it runs out of fuel, or if you stop feeding it, don't make the fire bigger, then comes the kind of equanimity. Call it nirvana, just call it peace of mind, call it tranquility, I don't know what you call it. Stoicism is similar in that way. They kind of think that being free from passions, excessive passions, or putting passions in their place is the source for contentment. Now, how does that translate onto a larger, geopolitical scale? Well, acquisition and acquisitiveness, whatever it is, whether it's GDP or, economic growth, that you tell me a politician who doesn't talk about economic growth, right? Anybody stands up, I'm for degrowth. Nobody's going to do that, right? But it's the same thing. We want more because we think we don't have enough, or we want different because we think it's better. And that all starts, it's as facile as it sounds, it starts with the human person, right? It starts with you and with me, of ceasing to be acquisitive, not being happy with what you have, knowing when enough is enough, knowing what a limit is. This is enough, this is good, and let's make sure everyone has enough. So, I mean, Seneca and Buddha are, I think, on the same page in that kind of way of thinking. Is that making sense?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm not sure it's true, but yes.
So I'm trying to sort this out. Seneca was around when Nero burned down Rome.
Yes.
So why does he reflect on the burning of Lyon when he talks of fire? And I'm asking it this way because if we're in the middle of our own fire currently, and it's very hard to move yourself out of the trauma to write the letter to your friend in Lyon?
That's interesting. That's a really interesting observation. Like, I'm pretty sure, I have to go back and look at the letter. I don't think that he references the fire at Rome, which actually, so the fire at Lyon, I think was 64 CE, 64. And Seneca dies in 65, so it's close to the end of his life. But the fire at Rome was right around the same time. So I think you're asking, like, why does he talk about Lyon when he could be talking, close to home? And I'm not sure, but scholars being what they are, I would not be surprised if some literary scholar or some philosopher read Seneca's letter as sort of a, when I want to say a calque or an allegory for the fire that also took place at Rome. In other words, it was in the back of his mind, even if he didn't.
That one, but it's also
Even if he didn't say it, right? So the Lyon thing, which happened far away, in France, in the colony or in the province, was arm's length and safer to talk about or something. But that's gives me something to think about. It's an interesting point.
You were using expressions about fire. Is that a figure of speech or a literal?
Yeah, both. So, very good question. Both. So that the actual physical, like say for instance the Buddha, when he's speaking to that audience of Brahmins who do keep an actual fire going, like a home fire burning as part of their ritual, duties as Brahmin priests. That's a literal fire. But then what the Buddha's genius was to kind of allegorize that or make it figurative and saying everything is on fire, not just that actual ritual fire you got burning in your hearth, but the one you have burning in your heart too. Heart, that little funny thing there. But so it's both. And it's easy to talk about something figural. I mean, the campfires were very real. The campfire and the Palisades fire, awful. But it's interesting how that has been used so consistently in so many different traditions as a metaphor for something almost out of control, or rapidly destructive, or we speak of conflagration and consummation by fire. It does seem to engulf in a way. Well, I mean, water too. Cataclysm, flooding. Some say the world will end in fire. Some say in ice. From what I've tasted of desire, I hold with those who favor fire. That's Robert Frost. But so those two, fire and water. I don't know. Luke.
Fire's next, right? We've had the water, the flood, so we're awaiting the final conflagration. Genesis times, right? And James Baldwin. So I'm struck by two ways you talked about trauma in different cases.
Yeah.
One as in a way that I think it is for Seneca as a sort of test, right, of your wisdom, your equanimity, your ability to recognize that these things are permanent. There's no rationale for being attached to them.
Yep.
And then trauma is sort of transformative. On the one hand, with Thoreau, having that experience of burning down the conquered woods,
Yep.
and of the Buddha or Shakyamuni, where it's old age, sickness, and death, and both of those, on your telling, sort of provide an impulse.
Right.
And the difference between the sort of Thoreau case is there's a clear human culpability, in fact, Thoreau's very own. But with the Buddha, old age, sickness, and death, as you pointed out, there's no question of human culpability, which is a certain sort of limit to the horizon or how he talks about human suffering or is thinking about it in that case.
Right.
And it strikes me that the sort of problem or sort of challenge of climate trauma is it's sort of both at the same time. Nobody dumped all the rain on that side of the mountain, and that much rain has never fallen in that gully before, and it swept away your house. But at the same time, it's demonstrably a consequence of the growth, economics.
Right.
So that seems to me to be the sort of particular conundrum of how we think about or sort of respond to this kind of climate trauma, how we live with it.
Right. Yeah. So they did a study. There was a study I read on the victims of the people who experienced the campfire in 2018. They did a study and they said that they were actually cognitively impaired, cognitively changed by the experience. Not just PTSD, what you would expect, but actually they were changed. The neurons were misfiring or something like that, and it's like, okay, fair enough. I mean, as you just pointed out, a trauma does change us, but then again, you're always faced what to do with that, right? You can be traumatized, but then you can choose not to be traumatized. I mean, I think any therapist worth their money is going to tell you, you can choose not to be a victim. And so choice, I mean, this is not quite what you're asking, but this is what comes to mind when what you said, is that, we do always have a choice in how we respond to anything. And so that's within our power. And so I think for the three of my guys here, even though they're slightly different in how they talk about or treat trauma, they're all saying you do have a choice how you respond to the situation we face, even if it's different. So I think that's important, because part of the idea of being traumatized is that you feel like you are powerless. You don't have any choice, nothing you can do. You're totally a victim. In some ways, some people can feel that way, and that can be a reality on the ground for some people. But to feel empowered, I think, is very important, and to be able to respond, psychically respond, mentally respond, emotionally respond, is important. Okay, we're past time, so I'll be happy to talk to you afterwards or whatever, but thank you for coming.
Thank you very much.